Okay, so we're here today with Dean Somerset, all the way from Canada. Dean, welcome. Welcome to Storm Fitness. Dean, for those of you who don't know, is a strength expert and physical therapist from Canada. Dean, I thought we'd just get together, have a bit of a chat today about a few things in the industry and a few things that interest both you and I. Firstly, we're just going to talk a little bit about corrective exercise, Dean. I know that you use corrective exercise as part of your programming. When is the time to set corrective exercise, and when is the time to get your hands in there and get in on the soft tissue stuff, do you think?
Well, first, I'm not actually a physiotherapist or physical therapist. I'm a strength kinesiologist, but I do work with a whole bunch of physiotherapists and chiropractors, massage therapists. So part of the process is figuring out whether or not the person should be in the gym or whether they need to have more direct hands-on training. And a lot of that comes down to the assessment process. If they have pain, if they have issues that are unstable or something that's causing swelling, inflammation, anything like that. So in stuff like that, I try to get them out the door into a physio's office to make sure that they can get looked at initially. But from a corrective standpoint, a lot of the time it comes down to what they present with when they're in front of me. So if they look at me, or if they come in and they say, my back is sore, then I look at why their back is sore. I don't try to say, oh, well, here's an exercise that works well for the back. I try and figure out what the root cause is from that. Sure. And if I can't figure it out, then obviously I refer them out. But most of the time, it comes down to one of two or three things. Either there's too much mobility in a section, too little mobility, and there's too much mobility from somewhere else, or there's a lack of stability coming from the area. And a lot of time with low back, let's say, for example, it's an unstable spine. So the spine is expected to buffer against a load. If it's not able to buffer against that load, it winds up moving more than it's supposed to, which creates pain, impingement, all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah, sure.
So
do you sort of take on a joint by joint approach to your analysis, or are you looking at the movement pattern as a whole?
You know, joint by joint is one of those really cool things that kind of saves a lot of time, rather than you having to think about it as being, well, when I look at the knee, do I need to look at the hamstring? Do I need to look at the quad? Do I need to look at tibialis posterior? Do I need to look at all the individual muscles? If you look at the joint-by-joint approach, it saves a lot of time by saying the knee should be stable. The knee should be swinging around or sliding or doing any of that kind of stuff. But then you realize it's not stable and they have knee pain, then you have to kind of expand your search process and figure out why the knee isn't stable and why they have pain beyond that. So the joint-by-joint is great as far as what it's usable for. Just like Great Cook's FMS, it's a screen, it's useful for some things, but it doesn't tell you all the answers. That's when you are able to get a good direction on where the answer may be coming from. But then from there, you're going to have to dig a little bit deeper.
Okay, cool. And what kind of things are you presented with on a day-by-day basis, Dean? I know that a lot of your work now is online, but in the work you do with people one-to-one, what sort of things are popping up?
Well, as much as I do online stuff, I still work about 10 or 12 hours a day in health club. So I still get quite a bit of people in front of me that I have to work with in the individual aspect. I just had a consult with the goalie for Team Canada's women's national hockey team. She had some hip-related stuff that she's getting MRIs and X-rays on. And just looking at how she was moving, I was thinking that it was completely the opposite of what her doctors and physios were telling her. And I mean, just between you and I, I'm sure this is going out online, but she had something where the doctors were saying that it was a structural issue, and I'm thinking it's more soft tissue. So I was able to take her through one or two corrective exercises to show her that as soon as she was able to upregulate those muscles and get them going on, her pain reduced, she was able to move well, she was able to hit splits both sides. So that's something that's pretty fun to be able to do. Okay,
so say for instance, if we were to take kind of a hockey player like that, Dean, would to what degree would you be looking at the specific demands of her sport as opposed to just what a human should move like?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at an elite level athlete, they're what you would consider non-normal, just because of the fact that they're expected to have adapted to whatever their sport they're playing. This is a girl who has to have excessive amounts of flexibility to be able to hit splits in multiple directions, be able to get up, get down really quickly. So hip mobility is well outside of the normal parameters for a normal person. I mean, if you get your knee to your chest, that's normal for most people. She has to be able to get her knee to her chest, internally rotate, externally rotate the other leg, and then be able to bounce back up after dropping to the ice and wearing about 40 pounds worth of padding. So what her normal is so far excessive of what the normal population would be that it's off the charts as far as what the normal scales would be. So when I'm looking at her mobility, I would expect her to have nothing less well beyond normal ranges of motion. But at the same time, I would hope that she would have enough stability through her core, through her shoulders, through her hips to be able to control that range of motion.
Yeah.
So most people, I've worked with quite a few hockey goalies because they usually wind up developing things like groin pulls or ab strain, stuff like that. I find a lot of them have really good passive mobility, meaning they can drop into the splits, but they can control that mobility.
Yeah.
So if I get on their back and say, raise your leg up, they struggle with it.
Okay.
If I say stand on one foot, they can't do it. Just because they're used to dropping into the movement and then getting right back up. They're not used to lifting the leg in through that movement.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting you say that, Dean. I had a consultation with a movement specialist from Manchester who used to be a player for Manchester United, got injured, became very motivated to improve other athletes' mobility and movement patterns. And he said the same to yourself. You know, it's so much of flexibility these days is and mobility is measured by what you can do at the end of your range, as opposed to actually being able to perform the movement in a controlled manner. What are your thoughts on that?
Totally agree. I mean, it's one thing to be able to have the mobility to have somebody lean on your leg to put you in the splits, and there's another thing to be able to get your leg high enough, let's say in mixed martial arts, to be able to kick somebody in the head versus being able to hit the splits on your own. I mean, if you're in a competitive situation, you need to be able to use your hips as much as possible. It doesn't matter whether you can hit the splits on your own in practice where you're just kind of leaning on it. You have to be able to use every inch that you have. I mean, let's look at a soccer player, for example, or English football, I guess you could say. But for them, they have to have tremendous hip flexor mobility and glute mobility, plus the power to be able to get through it. If they have a weak or stiff hips actively and they can only bring their leg through to about 45 degrees, they're not kicking that ball very far. Whereas even if they can drop into the splits, that's great. But if they can't kick the ball and get the foot up over the level of their hip, that ball's going to be sitting stationary. Interestingly,
the most common injury in football, English football or soccer, or whatever we're going to call it, is soft tissue problems with the hamstring and knee stability issues and ligament issues. So it's interesting that you say that. Now, Dean, for a lot of the guys that we train, we train a lot of. We've got some CrossFit guys, we've got some strength athletes, and people who just liked coming in and lifting. So I thought we'd just touch on the deadlift. What are you looking for when you're when you say that you're in a health club at the moment? If you go into a health club, does everybody deadlift well?
No, not even close. There's been a couple of times where I wanted to face palm or throw my head through a wall or something like that, just watching the average individual deadlift. But I mean, I'd rather see them trying than to sit on the couch and not try whatsoever. So I'll give them credit where credit's due. But the most of the time, people think that a deadlift is a back exercise, so they think that they need to make their back do the work. Back isn't even supposed to be doing any kind of movement. You'll feel it because it's trying to stabilize and connect upper body to lower body, but it's not creating big ranges of motion through any kind of a movement parameter. The majority of the work should be being done by the hips. The hips should be pressing horizontally through that movement to be able to cause you to stand up. So for a lot of people when they deadlift, I was trying to say, use your hips on this exercise. Don't make it a lift, make it a horizontal hip press. And as soon as they start realizing that, okay, I don't use my back on it, I use my hips, they start to lock up their torso, they start to get their hips to move, they get that vertical tibia, and they actually feel what they're supposed to feel, which is the pre-stretch through the hamstring and glutes, and their back feels nothing. Which means it's going to be way more safe to be able to lift things heavier later, and I won't have to worry about their disc shooting across the room and taking someone's eye out.
Sure, And just on that, whilst we're talking about keeping the back into in a stable and straight position where there's going to be little stress on the vertebral discs. Often I think in strength training there's when you see people uploading their 1 rep max, there's different opinions, on people who are saying, well, great, you lifted it, but your form was terrible. Your form came out a little at the end of range there, or do we actually allow people to come slightly out of range on maximal deadlifting, or can it only be form? Can it only be to form failure?
It depends. I mean, that's a really good question, and that's a really big answer, but the best answer I can give right now is that it depends. If the person has a history of injury to the low back, SI joint, or anything along that line, I wouldn't want them to lift to a point where they would go outside of neutral,
No.
just due to the fact that there would be that massively increased risk that they would have a relapse.
Yes.
That's all from me just being gun shy, but for somebody like, let's use Brett Contreras as an example.
Yep.
He wrote a T-Nation article a little while ago about in defense of the rounded back deadlift.
Yep.
For him, he prefers that slight rounding to it, and maybe that's hip restriction to him or something like that. I don't know. I haven't seen him move directly, but for him, he seems to work best when he has that slight rounded back. Look at something like Eric Cressy. If you look at his max pulls, he has a really thoracically kyphotic stance when he pulls and does a lot of work with his erector spinae. But at the same time, if you talk to those guys, they'll say the first thing, don't break from neutral when you're training, when you're learning the exercise, when you're working up to it. When you're doing your training, about 99.9% of the time, it should be spent in that neutral spine, working on keeping the spine erect, keeping the spine tight, keeping the spine stiff, so that one time when you do move outside of it, it's able to maintain, able to control, to be able to get the weight up without having any kind of negative side effects.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And when you look at some of the research that Stu McGill's done on deadlifting, he showed that elite powerlifters were able to get to within 2 to 3 degrees of terminal flexion of their spine and maintain there for every single lift when they were doing max efforts. So to say that you absolutely have to be in that neutral spine is kind of erroneous. I mean, it's ideal because it gives you the lowest chance of injury. But at the same time, if you're lifting maximally, there's always going to be a chance of injury no matter what posture your spine's in. The guys that are really skilled with it are the ones that are able to hold flexion and be able to maintain that flexion stance throughout the entire thing without buckling, shearing, anything like that. But again, those are the elite guys. That doesn't mean it's the example for the average gym goer.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And whilst notice you mentioned Stuart McGill there, Dean, and just whilst we're on that, other members in the industry, can I just ask you a few names, and you can just give me your honest opinion on them if I can. I mean, obviously none of us are in a position to judge other professionals. They all have their way of doing things, and I'm sure they have results on it. But just from your standpoint, can I give you just a few names, and you give me a few words about how you think, what your impression of their approach is?
We'll give it a go. We'll see what kind of names you're throwing out and see.
Okay, Mike Boyle.
A good filter. Mike? One of the godfathers of the industry. He was one of the guys who popularized a lot of the strength training concepts that are widespread.
Yeah.
He has his opinions on when things work and when things don't work, which is great because everybody has opinions on things.
Yep.
And the cool thing is that he's willing to evolve his opinions based on what research comes out.
Yes.
If he's done work on something with 5,000 athletes and new research comes out that says that what he was doing doesn't work, he'll test out the new thought process with his next 5,000 athletes and see, does it work well, does it not work well, as the stuff I was doing previously. So at that point, he's able to say, you know what, he's got that sample size that's able to take a huge amount of information, boil it down to individual facts.
Yes.
I mean, I'm looking forward to potentially going to my coil strength and conditioning this summer and seeing how he runs it. But from talking with Mike, talking with Ben Bruno, talking with Tony Gianocor, Eric Cressy, those guys all say that place is just like a factory. They got about 20 people, 30 people in there every 15 minutes all day long, every day. And it's just a factory where they're just pumping people through. But everybody's getting stronger, everyone's getting fitter, and it's just a really cool facility. And the fact that he's been able to pump out as much info as he has and change as many lives as he can, that's awesome.
I have to say, while we're on that, a big thank you to Mike, because we use some of his templates for the linear and lateral days with our with some of our young athletes, and we've had some great results with that. Now, Joe DeFranco.
Joe's really cool.
Yep.
A lot of the stuff that he does is really cutting edge. He uses a lot of the thought processes that have been ingrained in pretty much any exercise science practice, but he just puts a little tweak on it. And the fact that he's able to hack through the NFL Combine and find simple ways like changing your foot position to shave half of a second off of 40-yard dash time, that's really cool. I mean, he does a couple of things here or there that may or may not be perfect, but who does? I mean, I'm by far not the most great example of somebody who does everything perfect. I mean, there's always going to be people out there who like to detract on others. But a cool thing is I'm actually going to DeFranco's gym in end of March for the CPPS certification that him and James Smith, Smitty, we're going to... And I'm actually on the board of directors for that certification, so I'm going to observe it, do a little speaking with it, so it'll be really cool to see what his facility looks like in person.
Brilliant. Okay, Brett Contreras.
Brett's cool. I mean, he knows his stuff inside and out. The one detraction I would have on him is that he tends to put his thought process above everyone else's, which, again, he's got the research to back it up, and he's an incredibly smart guy when he's doing that kind of stuff. And at the same time, he's able to get the results that he needs. But when he starts bashing people like Charles Poliquin or whatever, who have nothing to gain by talking about him or nothing to gain by doing anything like that, it may not be in his best interest or to further advance the thought process of fitness.
Yeah.
But I mean, the fact that he was able to popularize something like the glute hip bridge, which is a massively beneficial exercise for a lot of people. I use it with my own clients, and also use a lot of the research that he's come out with on glutes and the function of the hip and extension for things like sprinting, on-ice performance, off-ice performance, aesthetics. I use a lot of that with my clientele too.
Yep.
So that's a really cool guy. We email back and forth all the time. He calls me out if I do something wrong, and I try to call him out when he does something wrong, and then he emails me with like 50,000 different research reports. Yeah, we got a good working relationship going on.
And just the other one we just mentioned his name just there, Charles Poliquin.
Poliquin was another one of those grandfathers of the industry who pretty much set everything in place, and 90% of what's used in strength and conditioning now has some root to something that Poliquin wrote about, either recently in the 90s and the 80s, something along that line. He was the one who essentially characterized and brought about the thought process of personal certifications. So before that, there weren't things like FMS certifications or CPPS certifications. So the fact that he was able to put his name out there on not just his own product line, like supplements and stuff like that, but also on his name for certifications, for all that kind of fun stuff. Yeah. He was able to essentially popularize the concept of fitness as a brand. So everyone who runs a business involved in fitness that's not just a gym has Poliquin to thank for it in one way or another.
Yeah, great.
Now, is all of his research perfect? No. At the same time, I've seen a lot of the stuff that he's taught in his level 1, level 2 courses, and it hasn't changed in about 15 years.
Yeah.
That might have been updated a little bit here and there, but I've seen a lot of the stuff that he does for rotator cuff that I've also seen research papers show direct correlations to saying what he's doing is not correct.
Yeah. And
they've shown different ways of doing it. When he's actually been presented with that, maybe he takes into consideration or not, but at the same time, he's got a brand to protect and a product to protect.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not something that he is looking to update. But, I mean, from the strength and conditioning standpoint, a lot of the stuff that he's put out there is still being used.
Yes.
Like German volume training is by no means something that was put out in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, I think it was like 15 years ago it was originally published under his name, and it's still being used in the gyms today. So a lot of people definitely owe him a little bit.
Yeah. All right, great. And just one last thing in leaving, Dean, we kind of have a tradition here at Storm where whereby we will have to give ourselves a gym name when we walk into the gym, and basically the way it's decided is you come up with the most out there, most complimentary, most almost aggressive nickname for yourself. Is there anything that springs to mind?
Oh God, I don't know. I'm probably the worst person when it comes to self-promoting. I mean, if you've seen my website, you know how cookie cutter and make myself look. So I have no idea.
You don't have to come up with anything just now, Dean. You can maybe next time. But just to let you know, steak knife, chainsaw, and tower block are all gone at the moment, so you have to think of something else.
Make awesome? How about that?
That's good. You could be awesome. All right. Well, thanks very much for talking to us, Dean, and maybe we'll see you again. Maybe we can have a chat about something else in the future. But good luck with your. Sorry, just before we go, you know, you've got a DVD coming out soon. Just tell me a little bit about what you hope to achieve by putting that DVD together.
Yeah, it's out now, actually. It's a workshop I taught a little while ago. That's a 3-day workshop that I condensed down to a 12-hour video series.
Yep.
It's called Post-Rehabilitation Essentials.
Yep.
So for personal trainers, fitness professionals who work with the general public, who want to know about things like rotator cuff injuries, knee injuries, back injuries. This goes through the most common injuries out there, the etiology behind why they happen, how they happen, and also what you can do about them as a trainer.
Okay.
So assessment practices, different ways that you can determine whether it's structural or soft tissue,
yep.
As well as when you should refer out, when you shouldn't refer out,
yep.
corrective strategies, and I even put together template workouts that you can do with just anybody who's going through those specific injuries.
Brilliant. I'm sure a lot of guys out there watching this will probably want to get a hold of that. Where can somebody buy that? Can we buy that on the internet?
Go to www.postrehabessentials.com.
Okay. Dean, thank you very much for your time, and it's been great to speak to you.
You too, man. I'm actually planning on going to London sometime in September. My wife's doing the World Triathlon Championships, so maybe at some time then we'd be able to go for a beer or two.
Or maybe a green tea, mate.
Yeah, thank you. Why not?
Why not? All right, good to speak to you, mate. Thank you very much.
You too.
See ya.